Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us. My name is Mel Underbaki. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. And we just rewatched the film, No History of Violence, the film that tells the story of 10 young men, boys really, who had no history of violence or criminal background of any sort. Yet these kids, teenagers, were investigated and indicted on terrorism charges. And we have four excellent panelists to discuss this film. We'll have in a few minutes Ellie Bernstein, the filmmaker of this and other important films. She's having technical problems, but she'll be here, I think. We also have Trevor Aronson, investigative journalist and author of an excellent book, The Terror Factory Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. Ikran Abdurrahman joins us. She's a family member of one of the indicted boys and part of our CCF family, longtime friend. And also Dominique Diadigo Cash. Sorry if I got that name wrong, who I'm just meeting today, but he's a community organizer in St. Paul and a restorative justice practitioner, and he's able to join us. And I'm going to start with Trevor. So Trevor, I just reread the article you wrote in 2016 called The Minnesota Connection. And when you talked about this case, I wonder if you could tell us how this case got its start. Like, how did these boys come to the attention of the FBI in the first place?
Hey, Mel, thanks for having me. So it might be helpful to kind of understand a little bit of like the short historical context of the FBI's view of the Minnesota Somali community as I understand it. So when I first started reporting on the subject area around 2009 and 2010, I remember a lot of FBI agents telling me that there were concerns, among, FBI agents that, given the large Somali population, that there was kind of threats of terrorism in various ways, but that it was seen as significantly different than other kind of threats within the United States as the FBI saw it, because the primary driver of Somalis in the Minnesota area tended to be leaving the country and fighting with Shabab in Somalia, and that was seen as less of a threat in the sense that to the FBI, there was less of a kind of threat internally and less of a threat of coming back and having the fight inside the United States, because the fight was very much in Somalia at the time. And then that view of the FBI began to change around 2013, 2014, when Shabab formed an alliance with Al-Qaeda, and there was the mall shooting in Kenya, and this feeling within the FBI that, perhaps people who were, supporting Shabab in some way may pose a threat similar to people who have, Al-Qaeda sympathies and similar. And then finally, what ended up happening, obviously, in 2014 is kind of the rise more globally of ISIS propaganda. And what we saw was that the FBI was really concerned about this man named Abdi Noor, who went from Minneapolis and joined ISIS, and then, was posting stuff on Twitter. And, at one point was in contact with Bashir, Abdulrahman Bashir, the informant in this case, and was, encouraging, according to the FBI, some of these members from the community to go over and travel. But ultimately, no one else, in that community or in that group who was necessarily, connected, as the FBI saw it, to Abdi Noor, ended up making it. And my understanding is that Bashir ended up having second thoughts for a variety of reasons, realizing that, obviously going and fighting in Syria is very dangerous and you could die. And then also realizing that, much of the teachings he saw as ISIS ideology were actually un-Islamic, and he began to kind of back away. And that's when, effectively he becomes an FBI informant, being offered a lot of money, and ends up kind of pushing the plot forward and engineering this group of people to move forward in this plot to join ISIS in Syria, even though along the way they kind of showed that they were unable to do that. And so this was an example, I think, of the FBI, kind of allowing a crime to happen that wasn't going to happen otherwise, right? The crime being, conspiring to support ISIS by going there as a fighter. And so ultimately they kind of engineer this plot, including kind of this crazy story of fake passports in Mexico, in order to allow this group to then, be charged under the conspiracy law. And I think what's important with this case, as with many other post 9/11 terrorism prosecutions, is just the enormous power that conspiracy law has, in that you don't actually have to support a group like ISIS or Al-Qaeda or any foreign designated terrorist organization. You just have to think you're doing it, or take actions that you think you're doing. So even though, none of these young men effectively supported ISIS in any way. Just the fact that they were moving forward in a plot to try to join ISIS in Syria, even if that plot was helped, every step of the way, by the FBI's secret hand, is still enough to kind of allow for conspiracy charges in federal court.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Trevor. I think Ellie has just joined us. To go back to Ellie and just see, this film was quite important. Now, if you want to just talk about how you happened to make it, what inspired you to make this film about these boys?
Yes, I was thinking about that before. I was very interested in the CVE program. I had been in England, and they said there was a program about counterterrorism, and in England, in London. And I said, oh, and there's also a similar program in the United States. And I said, what's that? And they said, it's CVE, the Countering Violent Extremism Program. I'm very interested in that program. And when I came back to the United States, I found out that of the 3 cities that were targeted by CVE, Minneapolis was one of the 3 cities and was getting $1 million from the government for the CVE program. So I thought, well, I want to go to Minneapolis. And when I went to Minneapolis, it corresponded with the trial of the 3 young men that went to trial. So my interest in CVE and Minneapolis got very connected with the trial of the 3 young men.
Okay.
That's how it started.
That's how it started. But were there challenges involved in making this film?
Yeah, there were a lot of challenges because the Somali community is a very understandably insular community. They've been very watched since 2005, 2006. Clearly an outsider. So getting some trust was not easy to film.
Mm-hmm.
I did get it, but understandably it was difficult.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Ellie. And see, Ikran, your brother was one of the young men charged. You want to kind of tell us his story? And you were there at the time, as I believe, the filming went on. So if you want to tell the story, what he was like, how he got involved in all this.
Yeah, sure. So, salam everyone. Hello, my name is Ikran Abdurrahman. I am the sister of Zakaria Abdurrahman, who was charged in this case and sentenced to 10 years in federal correctional institution. He's currently served much of that sentence and is due to be released soon, God willing. And I just ask everyone here to keep him in your prayers as well as everyone else. In April of 2015, my brother at the time was a college student at Minneapolis Community and Technical College. It's now known as, I believe, as Minneapolis College. And as far as everyone who knew him from the outside was concerned, he was a smart young man. He was brimming with ambition and compassion for everything and everyone around him. He was volunteering with multiple charities. He worked as a security guard at a battered women's shelter. He had an internship with an organization that offered business technology training, and he worked in the IT department at the hospital that he was born in. And he was doing all of this when he was merely 19 years old. So I believe for him, it was his sort of nurturing nature and his compassion compounded with normal teenage zeal and angst to want to change the world around him that sort of accidentally led him to this. And I think looking back, there's numerous factors that make one susceptible to entrapment. And in this case, I should say that his age is the first of those considerations.
Mm-hmm.
But for my brother, I think having been raised in a home where we valued open and honest conversation, but right and wrong were sort of clearly defined, I noticed that my brother became quieter. He was a history buff, so he knew so much more about the nations that lay beyond America, and he was concerned about individual culpability to foreign occurrences, where tax dollars went, what's happening in other countries. He was struggling to understand sort of the fine balance between his conflicting identities, being Muslim and American, and sort of being Muslim and deciphering prophetic parables, for example, that urged Muslims, irrespective of geographical location, to think of themselves as one body, that if one limb aches, the entire body is suffering. And his other identity, his Americanness, that whilst he, I believe, likely felt loyalty to it initially, became sort of more and more disillusioned by what it entailed as he dealt with racism and Islamophobia, or a combination of the two from American society. And his friends, who, while mainly they were interested in sports, also spoke about their shared concerns about the world, their identity complexes, and many other conversations. And I think it was a combination of all of these things that put my brother in a vulnerable place to be entrapped by the FBI. And as Trevor, you wrote in your sort of Minnesota Connection article, and I quote, I think you put it very eloquently, you wrote, "No one in the group had succeeded in leaving the US or in helping ISIS in any way. Their conspiracy consisted of talk and failed attempts to get on planes, all while the government was watching, and if I might add, instigating." That's as far as Zacchedia's involvement had gotten. He never once committed a crime on US or foreign soil. He never even had a minor misdemeanor on his record. And as Ellie's documentary demonstrated, there simply is no history of violence. So because if you mix the vital ingredients, that is, you know, impressionable teenagers, a sting operation, a paid informant, you know, preposterous funding for the FBI, an act, you know, that authorizes anything without any checks and balances, then you've got the perfect terrorist cocktail, really. And that's my brother's story. I think it's one that's, you know, sort of tragic and all too common. Why we've got great organizations like CCF trying to do their best to sort of counter the mainstream narrative.
Yeah, so he was sentenced to 10 years, is that correct?
That's right, yep.
Yeah, okay. So he's still got, when will he be released?
We're hoping he should be released hopefully later this year. I think they're trying to figure out halfway house situations, but I believe the earliest of the young men will be released in August.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Ikran. And I'm going to go back to talk a little more about CVE. I know, Ellie, there's a lot about it in your film. Just wondering how countering violent extremism, how it actually operated in Minneapolis. As you said, it targeted the 3 different cities, and Minneapolis was selected as one of them. There's, Richard, the Justice Department said the goal is to find terrorists before they become a terrorist. So that's amazing if they can predict the future, to me. So do you have any comments about how it's operated?
Well, you know, it was also kind of manipulated by the Attorney General at that time, Andrew Luger, who was extremely important in this process because he collected the $1 million check from the government for CVE. And he was a quasi supporter of the Somali neighborhood, which he wasn't. So it was kind of through him. You have to kind of put the blame also on him that he collected the $1 million check from CVE and dispersed it to a so-called social service organizations in Minneapolis. And he was also responsible for the kind of incredible propaganda that and pursuit of these 9 or 10 young boys. He was very ambitious, and he was hoping, as a Democrat, to work for Hillary Clinton. So I think that he's one of the responsible parties, not the only responsible party. So the far-reaching aspects of CVE through social organizations at that time in Minneapolis is I can't really speak to how they operated. Some of it is mysterious, but a lot of organizations were funneled money through CVE, sometimes not called CVE. And one thing that I really was curious about was when an organization got money from an organization, what was their responsibility in terms of reporting back about so-called radicalism in the community? I think that was a bit secretive, and I was always curious about that.
Okay, thank you. And I could like to hear a little about how that affected the community. I think you were in the community at the time, so all of these CVE activities, what effect did that have on your life personally and in the community?
Sorry, is that directed to Don or myself?
Oh, Ikran.
Oh, can you repeat that question for me? I apologize.
I'm just wondering, the CVE was in full swing up there, and you were there at the time. I just wondered at the time what kind of effects on the community were there, and you personally?
I think sort of. I think the CVE program was kind of happening really at the height of the trial, and it was a conversation that was happening between masajids, local community organizations, and there was efforts that were going on to make people aware of the fine print, if you will. But I think that many people were very sorry, noise is just many people, I think, were very felt very sort of apprehensive because obviously there was a lot of FBI involvement. There was this was happening at the height of a sting operation on 9 different families in the Minneapolis community. I think it divided many community members, and I think the effect of it really was that it made the vulnerable community even more mistrusting than it was before.
Yeah, and Dominic, I think you were also there at the time, and you're still there now. So, what would you like to tell us of what your thoughts are on CVE?
Yeah. First off, I want to thank Ellie and thank Coalition for Civil Freedoms for everything you're doing and for the invitation to be here. I think a couple of things that are important that have already been talked about is the way that these specious categories of radicalization or extremism or terrorism are being used to create these aggravations for folks, and kind of can be used to create a pipeline or a chain reaction from folks who, maybe are funneled in through regular criminal court. And so recognizing that CVE was piloted in the Twin Cities, it was really terminated in the Twin Cities by the name of CVE in 2016, when broad community pushback really allowed a lot of the organizations who were complicit in it to distance themselves from it professionally, as well as U.S. Attorney Andrew Luger, who was a large architect of this, to step down from that position. However, from then it kind of just evolved into new frameworks while establishing the same agenda. So after Trump took office, CVE was terminated for a little while, and it was reactivated as targeted violence and terrorism prevention in 2020 and 2021. And this was similar to CVE in that it got grants from Homeland Security into community organizations with, maybe the tacit mission of surveillance, or really what it's about is establishing relationships. And so by creating relationships within the community with these hand-selected folks, law enforcement was able to, like I said, establish these pipelines within the community with broad approval from, the unwitting public, and oftentimes. So I think an important thing to pay attention to right now in Minnesota as it relates to CVE is a piece of legislation called HF 2724, which is essentially a public safety reform bill in the House of Representatives, because there's a notable portion in there that wants to establish an Office of Public Safety Innovation. And that office is going to be staffed by a director and coordinators who are going to develop a strategy to, quote, address violence within targeted areas and promote healing and recovery. So this office is going to have a similar grant program for public safety innovation and establish a community grant board to oversee that. This could be a positive because it could fill in gaps in community justice that normally get occupied by law enforcement, but it could also lead to abusing these collaborations and these partnerships, and it presents the opportunity for local proponents of CVE to get funding to continue some similar programs. The last and maybe more relevant thing is Andrew Luger, who was, again, the architect of the Somali American Task Force, who helped to implement the local pilot for CVE, was nominated by President Biden this year to be reappointed to that position. The Senate overwhelmingly approved, the Democratic side of the Senate overwhelmingly wants to approve him and nominate him. However, it was blocked just this past week by Mitch McConnell under the impression that he's not tough enough on crime. So there's concern that the Democrats might want to double down on their support for him, but there are active efforts to challenge that and educate other senators around that. So I would recommend folks to reach out to the folks who are working on this public safety bill. Reach out to your representative in the Minnesota House. Ask which ways that this is going to be swayed from being bogged down by the same influences that created a surveillance pipeline for the Somali community during CVE, and to establish those relationships based on accountability and let them know, really be proactive about it. I hope that got to your question.
Mel, you're muted.
Thanks, Trevor. Anyway, you touched on this already a little bit about how their attempts to do anything were pretty much at an end. And then if you could expand a little bit about then what happened that went on, they all got indicted and put in prison. So how did that happen?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Yeah, Trevor. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the question because it was muted. Could you repeat that?
Oh, timing is off a little here. I'm just saying you've already touched on this a little bit about their basically any plans to go and do anything had come to an end. And they've all, I think you even said that Bashir had decided that this, it wasn't appropriate anymore. But then yet they all ended up in prison. They were indicted and put in prison. So could you expand a little bit on how that happened?
Sure. So as in this case, as in a lot of the other, terrorism prosecutions and stings we've seen in the post 9/11 era, it was an FBI informant who, kind of engineers everything and pushes the plot along. This case was a bit unique in the sense that this was, in a lot of cases that we see the use of an informant, there isn't the longer term relationship between the informant and the defendants that this case had. So, in any kind of sting operation, there is this active betrayal that happens in a sense, right? Like that this informant goes undercover and pretends to be a member of this group, if not a friend or close associate, and then, betrays the person in a way that sends them to jail for decades potentially. And this case was unique in the sense that, this was a very, there was a much closer relationship between the informant and the people who were targeted by the FBI than is normal, or is common, I should say. But in this particular case, the crime that could have happened ultimately didn't. Left to their own devices, this is a group of young men who, as we were talking earlier, were talking about the prospect of going to ISIS and to Syria, but ultimately did not accomplish that. And it was only through signing up the informant, who was a member of the group, but at that time had decided not to go to Syria and had largely dropped out of the group, by signing up this informant Bashir and paying him tens of thousands of dollars. They then engineer this plot where, among other things, they put together a call with someone who was supposed to procure them fake passports near the Mexican border. Turns out that's an undercover FBI agent. And so, a key part of this plot was being able to get them passports to leave the country, which they did not have. And the FBI was kind of at that juncture to make that possible. And so again, this is like an example, as in many of these post 9/11 cases, where the FBI makes it possible for the crime to occur. And this is really quite unique to terrorism prosecutions in particular. In many ways, it's kind of activating, pushing a thought crime, across the line so that you can bring it into court and say, like, hey, this person did it. At various times, I think almost every person has thought, like, hey, what if I did this? As an example, I'm sure there are many more people who've thought, like, hey, how could I rob that bank, than there are people who've actually gone and robbed banks, right? And so at what point are we kind of taking the seed of an idea, however bad, and not allowing that time to occur where the person says, no, I don't want to do that after all. And instead they kind of push them across the line. And that's what happened in this case, where, it seemed that, at various times members of the groups were interested in the prospect traveling to Syria and join ISIS for whatever their reasons were. And then ultimately they weren't able to accomplish that. And in the absence of that, accomplishment, the FBI essentially makes it possible and then makes that crime, prosecutable. And, as Dominique was mentioning, I mean, one of the, kind of the drivers of this obviously is money, right? And the metrics. And so, Congress allocates money toward counterterrorism. They spend $1 million on CVE in Minneapolis. And it's like, how do you, as a government official, kind of say, hey, I did my job. I accomplished this. And one of the things that we see being used as evidence of kind of a job well done and money being well spent are cases like this one, prosecutions that they can hold up and say, hey, we caught these, this group of young Somali American men and they were wanting to join ISIS. And that, so there's this, that creates this kind of built-in incentive to push cases that maybe, aren't, legitimate cases, but can be, portrayed as legitimate ones in order to justify the large amounts of funding that we're currently pushing forward in counterterrorism investigations.
Yeah. Do you see any slowdown in that?
No, I mean, obviously it's this strange kind of circular thing, right? Like you give money to, federal agencies like the FBI to combat terrorism, and then they are put under pressure to, find cases to justify that funding, and then they get more funding the next year. And then the only alternative to that cycle is, congressional representatives standing up and saying like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be spending so much money on counterterrorism if the threat is diminishing. Maybe we should spend it on other things. And then running for election every 2 years, that they then face a prospect where they have to be seen as like, lax on terrorism, and their opponents can, kind of paint them as like, soft on terrorism. And so it creates a very, politically difficult position in where, in the absence of brave politicians who are willing to kind of like stand up and advocate for a more sensible use of dollars and talk about kind of the counterterrorism industrial complex that we create with something like this. We just don't have that. And so in that way, what we see is just kind of the continuing amount of money flowing in and kind of the, evolution of the law enforcement in combating that, right? Like, obviously prior to the rise of ISIS, we saw a lot of Al-Qaeda related investigations and stings during ISIS's kind of, large propaganda influence. We saw a lot of ISIS stings. And now, like, even in the context of CVE, what we're seeing, post January 6th is a lot of these organizations that portrayed themselves as experts in, de-radicalizing, Islamists are now moving toward, white supremacists and saying like, we can de-radicalize them. So it really is this kind of money grab that's happening. That isn't to say, there's no threat of terrorism anywhere in the United States. Obviously, a number of kind of extremist ideologies have that potential, but we've really kind of blown up and exaggerated the threat. And cases like this are kind of seen as a way of kind of justifying a lot of this funding, in my view. Yeah.
Thank you, Trevor. Yeah, I went to the sentencing for one of the days, and one thing that I noticed that everybody, all the defendants had to stand up and say that they were terrorists and that they were not entrapped. And the other thing that I've noticed about the sentencing is the people that went to trial and were, wanted to prove their innocence got a lot longer sentences. Does anybody have any comments about either of those? This is for anybody.
I'll just add quickly on that. I mean, this is common to the federal system. When you are charged with a crime, material support and others, you are facing this enormous penalty if you take it to trial, right? Like decades potentially in prison. And so there is this built-in incentive for people to plead guilty. And the majority of people charged in federal court are ultimately convicted. I believe the conviction rate is over 90%. And, the majority of those people end up taking plea deals. And a big part of that is like, if you're, like in this case, if you're a young man, in your early 20s or your late teens, and you're facing a charge that could put you in prison for 20, 30 years, and the government comes to you and says, hey, take this plea and you can serve 8, it's a pretty attractive option. And I think that's in large part why we see so many plea deals in general, and also because of the high conviction rate. And so I think, something to keep in mind is like, as in any federal prosecution, the government has this enormous advantage. And then, kind of on the flip side, the bad thing about a lot of these plea deals is that it means a lot of the evidence of government misconduct and the aggressive use of stings often is not, shown to the public in the way it would be if it went to trial. And so it benefits the government to be able to like get, these plea deals. And as a result, they kind of create a landscape or a playing field that makes it very difficult to want to take a case to trial.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Well, you also touched on before, I'm going to stick with you, Trevor. You talked about the conspiracy law, in your article, you said that it shows the power of conspiracy laws against Muslims in federal courts today. And you talked about that a little bit. Is there anything you want to expand on that, or have you covered that?
No, I mean, I would just say, like, one thing to keep in mind if you look at kind of the wide breadth of cases, the terrorism cases that the Justice Department has brought since 9/11, there have been more than 900 defendants charged with terrorism-related crimes. But in a lot of these cases, there wasn't actually a terrorist involved. It was, a government agent posing as a terrorist, or the belief that the defendant was going to travel and join terrorists who, didn't actually know that person was traveling, right? And so, the conspiracy law allows a person to be prosecuted for the belief that they were benefiting the organization or a terrorist organization, even if in the end they were never in contact with a terrorist, they never knew a terrorist, and they never in any way benefited that terrorist organization. So it's a very, very expansive law that, just as a small example, there have been cases for which people have been prosecuted where they drove someone to an airport, but because they knew that person or believed that person was getting on a plane in order to travel to Syria and join ISIS, that effectively represented material support, conspiracy to provide material support. And so it is this hugely expansive law that gives the government a lot of leeway in how it's able to prosecute people, and be able to prosecute them for terrorism, even if they don't actually know any terrorists or got directly involved in terrorism in any way.
It seems a very dangerous law. Yeah. And Dominique, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, thank you. Really briefly, I wanted to touch on something Trevor mentioned earlier about the pivot in intelligence communities and maybe among elected officials to focus on the threat presented by right-wing extremists in the United States, while applying the same framework that they developed by, throwing the Black community under the bus, the Somali community under the bus. And I think some of the risks that come with that haven't really been articulated as much, because obviously since like the attack on the Capitol, there's been more attention on extremism and radicalization. And since the rise of Trump, there's legitimate reasons to be concerned about that. But there's also legitimate reasons to be concerned that when U.S. intelligence agencies or law enforcement agencies come into communities of color and say, hey, we can offer you protection, we can partner with you and protect you from these threats, that they're only going to exploit these to regain access to communities to exploit the most vulnerable, right? And I think that there's a number of reasons that we can count on that. One, because of the parallel reality of like civil liberties and law in the US says that like the dominant class is never going to face the same realities that the more vulnerable, marginalized people do. Also, like Trevor mentioned, there's no radicalization science. This is like, it's a nonlinear process. This is a bogus collection of social sciences created only to justify, military takeover, militarization, law enforcement, civilianization of law enforcement. And finally, I think that folks who uphold the status quo, despite being non-state actors or violent extremists, are never applied the same level of scrutiny or punishment as those who don't represent the dominant culture. Case in point, how long did it take them to stop that caravan recently? And so I guess looking back, the FBI creates these categories of violent extremists, right, who can later be applied by these prosecutors to create these terrorism aggravations. There's things like we've heard countering violent extremism led to the development of the Black identity extremist category. There's the environmental violent extremist category. There's the anarchist violent extremist category. There's the sovereign citizen violent extremist category. So all the ways that these sciences can be propped up and validated are just more tools in the hands of prosecutors who are able to engage in, the things that they do beneath the surface. Because as everyone already has mentioned here, this was aided just as much by law enforcement community engagement as law enforcement community informants.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Does anybody else have any other things you want to add to this before we to the end.
If I can just briefly talk about some of the work that Free the Bros and other partnering organizations have been sort of continuing to do on the ground in Minneapolis. Currently, there is an initiative to sort of help raise funds to support the young men in re-entry and addressing any problems they have, as well as helping them rebuild their lives. Some of them, as I said earlier, are due to be released soon. And so as we're obviously deeply committed to helping these young men rebuild their lives and, have a sort of chance at a new beginning, but we can't do it alone. So if it's possible, I think CCF will post further information on the initiative as well as how to donate, because we do rely on your generous donations to sort of sustain the effort.
Yeah, I think we'll try to put that in the chat so people can see that, and we'll maybe follow up with that again in the future. Thank you for bringing that up. That's important to be united with the community. So any other final? And Ellie, I know, just let me get back to you. I mean, I know you want this film shown as much as possible. Why do you think it is important? I mean, oops, there you are. You're muted. Yeah, I don't know. We'll come back to you, Ellie. We're not hearing you. So. Let's see. Does anybody else have anything you want to add now? Let me try Ellie one more time. Are you unmuted now, or no? Still can't. Still can't hear you. But let me just say here, this War on Terror Film Club is presented by the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. So if you'd like to support this work, please donate on the Film Club website, or you can visit our website at civilfreedoms.org, or subscribe to our Patreon at Civil Freedoms. And I want to thank all of you for being here. It's a very important subject here, and you were all provided very important information. And if there are no further comments, I guess we will end. And I hope people join us next month for, let's see, we may have, I'm not sure if there's, we have a question from the audience. People are asking about Bashir. What has happened to him? Does anybody know?
So as far as I'm concerned, he is still under sort of working for the FBI. I don't know if that means, continuing to be an informant, as typically seems to be the cases in many of these cases. But that's really as far as we know.
Okay, I shouldn't assume that was the community in general very torn up over this, I assume. Was that the case?
Oh, absolutely. I think there had to be a lot of work done to even sort of, I think in the height of all of these proceedings and people finding out who the informant was, because I think for a large portion of the trials and the proceedings, he was not named at all until the trial came, and then he had to be, sort of a witness and get on the trial stand. And that's, I think, when people actually found out who he was. And so obviously with a community as sort of insular and tight-knit as the Minneapolis community, it is incredibly hard to sort of mend those relationships and not make it an extension of, who else is involved, is the family, involved. And I think that trust and the lack thereof because of FBI involvement, government involvement in community is really deep-rooted and takes a lot to mend.
Yeah, I would imagine. We've had a few other comments from the audience. One of the comments that these young men watched these recruitment videos on YouTube. community, is there any discussion of how this type of video is available? Anybody have a comment about that? Or,
I mean, is the question how do people find the videos? Is that what?
well,
Uh,
it's available. How? I'm not
Yeah.
really clear about that question.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, the larger platforms like YouTube and Twitter, have been, quite aggressive in getting these off of their platforms. There is this weird, there's a couple of groups, like one is called Site Intelligence, and so they kind of monitor, the dark web and the kind of the more obscure corners of the internet where groups like ISIS would post propaganda. And for a time in 2014, 2015. There was this symbiotic relationship between groups like that and ISIS, where ISIS would upload, propaganda to these more obscure places on the internet, and it would take groups like Site to like find it and then funnel it, to places like CNN that would then, broadcast it. And so, there was this kind of irony in the sense that it was like, the US government and others were saying like, let's not like distribute this propaganda, but at the time it had such news value that there were organizations that were effectively helping ISIS kind of distribute it out there, not in any way that was deliberately helping it, but because it was news value, it became this kind of carry-on effect where propaganda was put on. But it's like with anything on the internet, if you really want to find it, you can. It's not you can't go to YouTube and find terrorist organization propaganda, but for those who are looking for it, it can still be found, even though there have been efforts by the larger platforms to keep it offline.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Another comment, the combination of the material support law and the conspiracy law is particularly pernicious. And any comments on that? I know the material support law is pretty much anything can be material support for terrorism. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's important to keep in mind with like material support as it pertains to foreign designated terrorist organizations like ISIS and Al Qaeda. There isn't any sort of statutory limit on a requirement on the type of support. It isn't like you need to give them money or you need to provide them with weapons. I mean, you could quite literally make a sandwich for an ISIS member, and that would be considered, material support, like helping them in any way. And so in that way, it's like so expansive that, just about anything you could do to potentially help a member of a terrorist organization, and then couple that with the conspiracy law, and you're talking about effectively kind of like planning to provide a small amount of support to a terrorist is effectively, prosecutable under federal law. And that's why it's so kind of, can be so abused by prosecutors in that way.
Yeah. It's another question. I think we talked about this a little bit, but what's the long-term impact on the community there? I think Ikram talked about that a little, but is there anything else anybody wants to add about that? Dominic, you're still in the community. You have any observations there?
I would say I'm in the Twin Cities, but I would defer to Ikran about maybe experiences within the Somali.
Yeah.
I mean, I think while the sort of trust building is still an ongoing effort, I think the way the Minneapolis community rose from sort of the ashes, if you will, and created sort of community-led initiatives to fill the gaping wound left behind by a justice system that, I think in large part masquerades as an emblem of equality, but then, deserves and mass incarcerates people that look like us and people that believe in what we believe. But I do think that in large part, it's been incredibly inspiring to see people who are meant to be sort of broken by these systems be able to rise from that and be able to, create alternative modes of supporting one another.
Thank you. Another question here. Maybe I'll go to Dominic with this one. What's the status of the Muslim community leaders in Minneapolis that worked with the government on these surveillance programs?
First, to acknowledge what folks said earlier, that a lot of manipulation occurred because the true intentions behind CVE here were so veiled. However, some folks did have more agency than others in exploiting their connections within the community in order to gain approval for what they knew would be negative. And some of those people are, in the House of Representatives in Minnesota right now. Folks were pressured and did distance themselves from the program who had earlier, like Representative Ilhan Omar had expressed tacit approval prior to her run for the state legislature before realizing that it would be more powerful to be one of the first legislators to take a stand against it, and has held that position since. There are more champions within the legislature who I think are liable to hold that line. And then there's other folks such as Holden Hassan, who were a part of the Somali American Task Force with Luger, that were a part of that. And as Ikram mentioned, there's been just immense fallout. There's been divisions within faith leaders who maybe did not have the same level of public rebuke that some of the nonprofit leaders who financially benefited from it did. However, it's just created a change in the way that folks are able to create community here. And there's been an increased skepticism around the role of community serving nonprofits, especially by young people, rightfully so. Because after facing a shortfall in public funding, these several nonprofit leaders were really eager to go after federal counterterrorism funding for their own community. And that gap still hasn't really been filled.
Yeah, the power of money. Yeah, thank you. I've got a question again for Trevor. Is the government still going after people for ISIS terrorism cases?
Yeah, obviously, despite, President Trump's comment several years ago that ISIS was defeated, it clearly hasn't been. It doesn't, retain its kind of territory that it had once before, but it's still very much an organization, as evidenced by the fact that, the Biden administration had killed its most recently announced leader, assassinated its most recently announced leader. And we are still seeing, prosecutions, announced, fairly regularly related to ISIS. The most recent was a woman who had led an American woman had led a brigade for ISIS in Syria, was extradited and is being prosecuted now. What we're seeing a lot fewer of compared to, say, 2016, 2017, are these sting operation cases where they would get young men and women who are interested in traveling to join ISIS involved in a conspiracy, and then they'd even buy them a plane ticket and drive them to the airport, and then when they get there, arrest them. That became a kind of common sting tactic in that period of time, and we're seeing a lot fewer of those. The question is, are we seeing a lot fewer of them because the diminished kind of capability of ISIS is inspiring fewer people to want to do that? Or are we seeing fewer of them simply because the FBI is running fewer sting operations, encouraging people to do that? And that, or it's a combination of those two things. That's a question we don't know. So while we are seeing some ISIS prosecutions continue and new ones announced, we're not seeing it at the level that we did, from say 2016 to 2018.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Has there been any response in the Twin Cities to the revelations that FBI whistleblower Terry Albury, who worked in that area, as for the practices of the FBI? I guess I read Terry Albury was an FBI agent. I believe he's in that movie. I believe his voice is in that movie. Has there been any response to that? Now he's come out as a whistleblower. Dominic, you're in the area. Do you any comments about that?
So aside from, I think, folks feeling a sense of validation and relief that someone from the inside has confirmed what was already known anecdotally, but what that can be turned into in terms of affecting actual change within intelligence remains to be seen. But I do believe that it's created powerful momentum, and hopefully he can cause others to be inspired by the same level of courage.
Yeah, I'm glad. That's one I want to go on saying I greatly admire him for coming forward, because I know it took a lot of courage. Yeah, I'm not seeing any more questions. Does anybody have any comments? Say, Ellie, have you got sound back? If you do have any. No. Okay. Okay. Yeah, let me just repeat again. We hope that we continue in this film club that, every month. And if you'd like to support it, please go and donate on the film club website. Or this is presented by Coalition for Civil Freedoms. So if you go to the civilfreedoms.org website, or subscribe on Patreon at Civil Freedoms. If you become a subscriber, you'll have your ongoing support for this important work. And thank you all to the panelists. Thank you very much for all of you being here. You were all very good. And thank you everybody for watching us, and we'll see you next month.